The grand cathedral of Aldoria fell silent as Queen Isabella's golden casket was carried down the marble aisle. Hundreds of mourners filled the ancient pews, their black attire creating a sea of grief that stretched from the ornate altar to the massive oak doors. Yet among all the tear-streaked faces and bowed heads, one person stood out like a beacon of inappropriate joy. Duchess Camilla, the late Queen's daughter-in-law, wore what could only be described as a smile. Not the subtle, polite expression one might expect at such a solemn occasion, but a genuine, almost radiant smile that seemed to grow brighter with each step of the funeral procession. Her emerald eyes sparkled with an emotion that had nothing to do with sorrow. The cathedral's stained glass windows cast colorful patterns across the mourners, but even these divine lights seemed dimmed by the wrongness of Camilla's expression. She sat in the front row, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, her platinum blonde hair styled immaculately despite the early morning service. Everything about her appearance suggested careful preparation, as if this day was one she had been eagerly anticipating. Most of the royal family and distinguished guests were too consumed by their own grief to notice Camilla's peculiar behavior. King Frederick, now the sole ruler of Aldoria, wept openly as he followed his mother's casket. Princess Charlotte, the Queen's beloved granddaughter, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Even the usually stoic palace guards seemed moved by the solemnity of the occasion, but Prince Alexander, the Queen's eldest grandson and heir to the throne, caught something others missed. From his position in the second row, he had a perfect view of his stepmother's face. What he saw there chilled him more than the cold stone floors of the ancient cathedral. While everyone else mourned the loss of a beloved monarch, Camilla appeared to be celebrating. The prince's trained eye, sharpened by years of diplomatic training and court intrigue, began to notice other details. The way Camilla's breathing seemed lighter, almost relieved. How her posture had straightened since entering the cathedral, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Most telling of all was the brief moment when she caught her reflection in the polished brass of a ceremonial candlestick, and her smile widened even further. Alexander's mind raced back to the events of the past week. His grandmother's sudden illness had come as a shock to everyone. Queen Isabella had been in perfect health just days before, attending state functions and maintaining her rigorous schedule. The doctors had been baffled by her rapid decline, speaking in hushed tones about mysterious symptoms that didn't fit any known condition. Now, watching Camilla's inappropriate joy, Alexander felt the first stirrings of suspicion. His grandmother had never trusted Camilla completely, though she had been too diplomatic to voice her concerns publicly. There had been whispered conversations between the Queen and her most trusted advisors, conversations that always seemed to end when Alexander entered the room. The funeral service continued with ancient hymns and speeches from world leaders, but Alexander found himself studying Camilla's every move. When the bishop spoke of the Queen's unexpected passing, Camilla's smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by what looked almost like satisfaction. When the congregation was asked to pray for the departed soul, Camilla's lips moved, but Alexander suspected she wasn't praying for his grandmother's peace. As the service reached its climax, and the Queen's casket was prepared for its final journey to the royal crypt, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He would investigate his grandmother's death, starting with the woman who seemed far too happy to see her buried. The prince had always been known for his sharp intellect and unwavering sense of justice, qualities that had made him a favorite of both the people and his grandmother. Looking around the cathedral one final time, Alexander noticed other subtle signs he had missed before. Several of Camilla's closest allies in the court were present, and while they maintained appropriately solemn expressions, there was something in their eyes that suggested they shared in Camilla's hidden celebration. A network of conspirators, perhaps, all relieved to see the old queen finally gone. The realization hit Alexander like a physical blow. This wasn't just about one woman's inappropriate behavior at a funeral. This was potentially about murder, conspiracy, and the future of the Aldorian throne. His grandmother, the woman who had raised him and taught him about duty and honor, might have been killed by someone she had welcomed into their family. As the final prayers were spoken and the mourners began to file out of the cathedral, Alexander caught Camilla's eye. For just a moment her mask slipped completely, and he saw something that confirmed his worst fears. In her emerald eyes he saw not just satisfaction but triumph. the look of someone who had won a game that others didn't even know they were playing. 3 days after the funeral, Prince Alexander sat in his private study, surrounded by documents and photographs that painted a disturbing picture. The official cause of Queen Isabella's death was listed as sudden cardiac failure, but Alexander's investigation had already uncovered several troubling inconsistencies that the royal physicians had either missed or chosen to ignore. The first red flag came from Dr. Helena Morrison, the Queen's personal physician for over 20 years. In a private meeting that Alexander had requested, Dr. Morrison revealed her own concerns about the Queen's final days. The symptoms had been unlike anything she had seen before, and the Queen's rapid deterioration had defied all medical explanation. Alexander spread the medical reports across his mahogany desk, noting the strange progression of his grandmother's illness. The Queen had complained of persistent headaches, unusual fatigue, and episodes of confusion that were completely out of character for the sharp-minded monarch. Most puzzling of all were the blood tests that showed traces of compounds that had no business being in a healthy woman's system. The prince's investigation had also led him to the palace kitchen staff, where he discovered that Camilla had been taking an unusual interest in the Queen's meals during her final week. According to the head chef, Marcus Thornfield, Camilla had visited the kitchens multiple times, claiming she wanted to ensure her mother-in-law was receiving proper nutrition during her illness. This was completely out of character for Camilla, who had never shown any interest in domestic affairs and typically left such matters to the household staff. More concerning was Marcus's observation that Camilla had specifically requested to prepare the Queen's evening tea personally on several occasions, saying she wanted to add special herbs that would help with the Queen's recovery. Alexander's suspicions deepened when he spoke with Margaret Fairweather, the Queen's longtime lady-in-waiting. Margaret revealed that in the weeks before her death, Queen Isabella had been acting strangely nervous around Camilla. The Queen had asked Margaret to taste her food before eating it, a precaution she had never taken before, even during times of political tension. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. While going through his grandmother's personal effects, Alexander discovered a hidden compartment in her writing desk that contained a letter addressed to him. The letter, dated just 2 days before her death, contained his grandmother's growing fears about Camilla's true intentions. In her elegant handwriting, Queen Isabella had written about strange conversations she had overheard between Camilla and certain members of the court. She described feeling increasingly unwell after meals that Camilla had helped prepare, and expressed her suspicion that someone was trying to harm her. The letter ended with a plea for Alexander to investigate if anything should happen to her, and a warning to trust no one completely. Armed with this new evidence, Alexander decided to dig deeper into Camilla's background. What he found shocked him even more than he had expected. Camilla's first husband, a wealthy businessman named Robert Sterling, had died under mysterious circumstances just 2 years before she married Alexander's father. The official cause of death had been ruled a heart attack, but the similarities to Queen Isabella's symptoms were impossible to ignore. Alexander's research revealed that Robert Sterling had also experienced sudden onset of neurological symptoms, unexplained fatigue, and rapid physical decline before his death. Like Queen Isabella, he had been in perfect health just weeks before his passing. The insurance investigation had found no evidence of foul play, but Alexander now wondered if the investigators had been looking for the right things. The prince also discovered that Camilla had inherited a substantial fortune from her first husband's death, money that she had used to establish herself in high society and eventually catch the attention of the royal family. Her transformation from a middle-class widow to a duchess had been remarkably swift, aided by her beauty, charm, and apparent devotion to charitable causes. But Alexander's investigation revealed that many of Camilla's charitable activities were merely fronts for building relationships with influential people. She had systematically cultivated friendships with key members of the royal court, always presenting herself as the perfect stepmother and devoted daughter-in-law, while secretly building a network of allies who would support her ambitions. The most chilling discovery came when Alexander found evidence that Camilla had been researching the line of succession extensively. Hidden in her private chambers were detailed charts and documents outlining exactly who would inherit what upon Queen Isabella's death. She had also been studying the legal requirements for regency, Should something happen to King Frederick before Alexander came of age? As Alexander pieced together the evidence, a clear picture emerged of a woman who had married into the royal family with a specific plan in mind. Camilla hadn't been content to simply be a duchess. She wanted real power, and Queen Isabella had been the primary obstacle standing in her way. The old queen's death wasn't just convenient for Camilla, it was essential to her larger scheme. The prince realized that his grandmother's murder was likely just the first step in a much larger conspiracy. With Queen Isabella gone, Camilla was now in a position to influence King Frederick more directly. And if something were to happen to the king, she would be perfectly positioned to serve as regent until Alexander reached his majority, giving her years of unchecked power over the kingdom of Aldoria. Alexander knew he needed more concrete evidence before he could make any accusations, but as he looked at the growing pile of suspicious coincidences and circumstantial evidence, he felt certain that justice for his grandmother was within reach. The question now was whether he could prove Camilla's guilt before she struck again. Alexander knew he needed an ally he could trust completely, someone with the skills and authority to help him gather the evidence he needed. He turned to Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, a brilliant investigator who had solved several high-profile cases involving the wealthy elite. Collins had earned a reputation for her discretion and her ability to uncover the truth even when powerful people tried to hide it. The meeting took place in a secluded coffee shop far from the palace, where Alexander could speak freely without fear of being overheard by palace staff who might be loyal to Camilla. Collins listened intently as the prince laid out his suspicions, her sharp blue eyes never leaving his face as she evaluated the credibility of his claims. Collins was initially skeptical, as she had seen many cases where grief and suspicion clouded people's judgment. But as Alexander presented the medical evidence, the timeline of events, and his grandmother's hidden letter, her professional instincts began to take over. The pattern Alexander described was consistent with deliberate poisoning, specifically with substances that would be difficult to detect in standard medical examinations. The detective agreed to conduct an unofficial investigation, understanding the delicate nature of accusing a member of the royal family of murder. Her first step was to arrange for a private autopsy of Queen Isabella's body, using advanced toxicology tests that hadn't been performed during the initial examination. This required calling in favors from forensic specialists who could work discreetly without alerting the palace or the media. While they waited for the autopsy results, Collins began investigating Camilla's background more thoroughly than Alexander had been able to do on his own. She discovered that Camilla had previously worked as a research assistant in a pharmaceutical laboratory, giving her access to knowledge about various chemical compounds and their effects on the human body. This background had never been publicly disclosed. When she married into the royal family, Collins also uncovered financial records that showed Camilla had been in significant debt before her first marriage to Robert Sterling. Her transformation from struggling graduate student to wealthy widow had indeed been dramatic, and the timing of her husband's death had been remarkably convenient for her financial situation. The detective found similar patterns in two other relationships Camilla had been involved in before meeting Sterling, both with older, wealthy men who had died under questionable circumstances. The investigation took a dangerous turn when Collins discovered that she was being followed. Professional surveillance teams were tracking her movements and her phone calls were being monitored. Someone with significant resources was aware of her investigation and was taking steps to interfere with it. This level of surveillance suggested that Camilla had powerful allies who were willing to protect her at any cost. Alexander, meanwhile, was conducting his own covert investigation within the palace walls. He began carefully observing the staff members who had regular access to the royal family's food and living quarters. What he discovered was troubling evidence of a conspiracy that went far deeper than he had initially suspected. Several key members of the household staff had received substantial financial gifts from Camilla in the months leading up to Queen Isabella's death. The head butler, Thomas Ashworth, had suddenly been able to pay off his mortgage and send his children to expensive private schools. The chief housekeeper, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, had purchased a new car and taken several expensive vacations that should have been far beyond her salary. Most damning of all was the discovery that Dr. Morrison, the Queen's trusted physician, had also been compromised. Alexander found evidence that Camilla had been paying for Dr. Morrison's daughter's medical school tuition, creating a powerful leverage point that could explain why the doctor had been so quick to accept the cardiac failure diagnosis without pushing for more extensive testing. The prince realized that Camilla had spent months, possibly years, building a network of people within the palace who were either loyal to her or compromised by her financial support. This network had enabled her to poison Queen Isabella, while ensuring that the death would be attributed to natural causes and that no serious investigation would be conducted. Alexander's investigation was complicated by the fact that he couldn't trust anyone within the palace completely. Even people who appeared loyal to the royal family might have been bought or threatened by Camilla's conspirators. He had to be extremely careful about who he spoke to and what information he shared, knowing that one wrong move could alert Camilla to his investigation. The breakthrough came when Collins received the results of the private autopsy. The advanced toxicology test revealed the presence of a rare plant-based toxin that would have caused exactly the symptoms Queen Isabella had experienced. The poison was derived from a plant native to South America, not something that would occur naturally in Queen Isabella's system or be detected in routine medical examinations. More importantly, the toxin was one that Camilla would have had access to during her time working in the pharmaceutical laboratory. Collins's research revealed that the lab had been conducting research on natural toxins and their potential medical applications, giving Camilla both the knowledge and the opportunity to obtain the substance used to kill Queen Isabella. With this concrete evidence in hand, Alexander and Collins knew they were close to proving their case, but they also knew that confronting Camilla directly would be extremely dangerous. She had already demonstrated her willingness to kill to achieve her goals, and she had a network of allies who would help her eliminate any threats to her position. The investigation had revealed that Queen Isabella's murder was just the beginning of Camilla's plan. With the queen gone, Camilla was now focused on consolidating her power and positioning herself to control the throne. Alexander realized that not only was his grandmother's killer still free, but that his own life might be in danger as well. As he prepared for the next phase of his investigation, Alexander made a decision that would put everything at risk. He would need to gather enough evidence to expose not just Camilla, but her entire network of conspirators. Only by revealing the full scope of the conspiracy could he ensure that justice would be served and that the kingdom of Aldoria would be safe from future threats. Alexander's investigation entered a new and dangerous phase when he decided to go undercover within his own family's circle. He began acting as though he suspected nothing, attending royal functions and family dinners while carefully observing Camilla and her associates. This charade required incredible self-control, as he had to smile and make pleasant conversation with the woman he believed had murdered his beloved grandmother. The first major breakthrough came during a state dinner, honoring visiting dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms. Alexander noticed that Camilla was paying particular attention to the seating arrangements and meal service, just as she had during Queen Isabella's final week. More troubling still, he observed her having quiet, intense conversations with several key palace staff members, including some he hadn't previously suspected of being part of her network. Using a small recording device hidden in his formal jacket, Alexander managed to capture fragments of these conversations. While the audio wasn't always clear due to the background noise of the dinner, he heard enough to understand that Camilla was planning something significant for the upcoming royal anniversary celebration. She spoke about timing, coordination, and the need for everyone to play their parts perfectly. Detective Collins, working from outside the palace, had been tracking the financial connections between Camilla and her conspirators. She discovered that the payments to palace staff had increased significantly in recent weeks, suggesting that whatever Camilla was planning required additional cooperation and silence from her network. The amounts being paid were substantial enough to ensure absolute loyalty, but also large enough to suggest that the stakes were extremely high. Alexander's worst fears were confirmed when he overheard a phone conversation between Camilla and an unknown contact. Speaking in what she thought was the privacy of her chambers, Camilla discussed the successful completion of the first phase of her plan and outlined her strategy for Phase 2. While she spoke in coded language, Alexander understood that she was referring to Queen Isabella's death as Phase 1, and that King Frederick was the target of Phase 2. The prince realized that his father's life was in immediate danger. The anniversary celebration, which was just 4 days away, would provide the perfect opportunity for Camilla to strike again. Hundreds of guests would be present, creating confusion and multiple suspects if anything went wrong. The elaborate meal service would offer numerous opportunities to introduce poison, and the celebratory atmosphere would make it easy to disguise any suspicious behavior. Alexander faced an impossible choice. He could warn his father immediately, but without solid proof, King Frederick might not believe him. Worse, alerting his father could cause Camilla to accelerate her timeline or flee the country before justice could be served. On the other hand, allowing the anniversary celebration to proceed could put his father's life at risk, along with potentially dozens of innocent guests. Working with Detective Collins, Alexander devised a risky plan to catch Camilla in the act while protecting his father from harm. They would allow the anniversary celebration to proceed as planned, but they would secretly replace key members of the kitchen and serving staff with undercover police officers. Hidden cameras would be installed throughout the dining areas, and every dish served to the royal family would be discreetly tested for toxins before consumption. The plan required them to trust a very small group of people, including Detective Collins's most reliable colleagues and a few palace guards, whose loyalty to Queen Isabella's memory was beyond question. Alexander struggled with the decision to keep his father in the dark about the danger, but Collins convinced him that King Frederick's natural reactions needed to be genuine to avoid alerting Camilla that they were onto her. As the anniversary celebration approached, Alexander noticed increased activity among Camilla's conspirators. Dr. Morrison made several unnecessary visits to the palace, ostensibly to check on King Frederick's health, but actually to coordinate with the other conspirators. Thomas Ashworth, the compromised butler, began making subtle changes to the serving arrangements that would give him better access to the royal family's food and drinks. The night before the celebration, Alexander discovered something that chilled him to the bone. While searching Camilla's chambers during her absence, he found a small vial containing a clear liquid hidden behind a loose panel in her wardrobe. When Collins had the substance tested by her forensic contacts, it proved to be the same rare toxin that had killed Queen Isabella, but in a much more concentrated form. The concentration was so high that even a few drops would be fatal within hours, and the symptoms would appear to be a sudden heart attack or stroke. Camilla wasn't just planning to poison King Frederick, she was planning to kill him quickly and dramatically during the anniversary celebration, ensuring that his death would be witnessed by hundreds of people who could testify to its apparent naturalness. Alexander also found detailed notes in Camilla's handwriting outlining exactly how she planned to administer the poison. She intended to use the traditional anniversary toast, when all the guests would raise their glasses to honor the royal family's service to the kingdom. The poison would be in King Frederick's champagne glass, administered just before the toast, so that he would collapse dramatically in front of all the assembled dignitaries. The cruel irony of using such a joyful moment to commit murder revealed the depth of Camilla's callousness. She wasn't just willing to kill for power. She was willing to turn moments of celebration into scenes of tragedy, forever corrupting the memory of what should have been happy occasions. With less than 24 hours before the anniversary celebration, Alexander and Detective Collins finalized their plan to catch Camilla red-handed. They would allow her to believe everything was proceeding normally, while secretly documenting every step of her murder plot. The evidence they gathered would be so overwhelming that even her network of allies wouldn't be able to protect her. But as Alexander prepared for what could be the most dangerous night of his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that Camilla might have anticipated their investigation. Her behavior had been too calm, too confident, as if she knew something they didn't. The prince wondered if they were walking into a trap, and whether their attempt to catch a killer might end up making them victims instead. The anniversary celebration would determine not just the fate of King Frederick and the future of the kingdom, but whether justice would finally be served for Queen Isabella's murder. Alexander knew that by the end of the next evening, either Camilla would be exposed and arrested, or she would have succeeded in her plan to seize control of the Aldorian throne through murder and deception. The morning of the anniversary celebration dawned gray and ominous, as if the weather itself sensed the dark events that were about to unfold. Alexander woke with his heart pounding, knowing that this day would either bring justice for his grandmother or end in another tragic death. Every detail of the plan had been rehearsed, but he understood that when dealing with someone as cunning as Camilla, unexpected complications were inevitable. Detective Collins and her team had arrived at the palace before dawn, disguised as temporary catering staff hired for the special occasion. The hidden cameras were in place. The undercover officers were positioned throughout the kitchen and dining areas, and the forensic equipment for testing food and drinks was ready. Every precaution had been taken, but Alexander still felt the weight of responsibility for his father's safety. The first sign that something was wrong came when Alexander noticed that several of Camilla's usual allies were absent from the morning preparations. Dr. Morrison had called in sick, claiming a sudden flu, and Mrs. Blackwood had requested emergency leave to deal with a family crisis. This deviation from the normal staff roster suggested that Camilla might have become suspicious of the investigation. Alexander's fears were confirmed when he observed Camilla's behavior throughout the morning. Instead of her usual confident demeanor, she seemed nervous and distracted. She kept checking her phone and looking around as if searching for hidden watchers. Her interactions with the remaining conspirators were brief and coded, suggesting they were communicating through predetermined signals rather than direct conversation. As the guests began arriving for the evening celebration, Alexander realized that Camilla had made a crucial change to her plan. Instead of waiting for the traditional anniversary toast, she was now focusing her attention on the pre-dinner reception. She had positioned herself near the cocktail service, where she could more easily access the drinks being served to the royal family without the extensive oversight that would surround the formal dinner. Detective Collins, monitoring the situation from her position in the kitchen, noticed the shift in timing as well. Through their concealed communication devices, she alerted Alexander that they would need to be extra vigilant during the cocktail hour. The informal nature of the reception would make it much harder to track every drink and ensure that nothing was tampered with. The critical moment came when King Frederick arrived at the reception, looking distinguished in his formal military uniform adorned with the medals and honors of his reign. Alexander watched as Camilla immediately moved to greet his father, her smile bright and welcoming as she guided him toward the bar area. To any observer, she appeared to be the perfect hostess, ensuring that the guest of honor received proper attention. But Alexander could see the predatory calculation in her movements. Camilla positioned herself between King Frederick and the other guests, creating a small bubble of privacy where she could work without being observed by most of the crowd. She engaged the king in animated conversation about the evening's festivities, while subtly maneuvering him toward a specific bartender who Alexander now realized must be another of her conspirators. The undercover officers had identified this bartender, James Morrison, as Dr. Morrison's nephew, recently hired for the event despite having no previous experience with palace functions. His presence was no coincidence. Camilla had arranged for him to be in position to serve the poisoned drink to King Frederick at exactly the right moment. Alexander felt his heart racing as he watched the carefully orchestrated plan unfold. Camilla distracted his father with charming conversation, while James Morrison prepared a special cocktail, ostensibly the king's favorite whiskey blend but actually containing the deadly toxin that had killed Queen Isabella. The level of coordination required for this operation revealed just how extensively Camilla had planned every detail of her conspiracy. Detective Collins, watching through the hidden cameras, saw Morrison's hand movements as he prepared the drink. The bartender used a small dropper to add what appeared to be bitters to the whiskey, but Collins knew from the investigation that this was actually the concentrated poison. The amount being added was precisely calculated to ensure King Frederick's death would appear to be a sudden cardiac event. As Morrison prepared to hand the deadly cocktail to King Frederick, Alexander knew he had to act immediately. The plan had been to catch Camilla in the act of administering the poison, but the timing was happening faster than they had anticipated. If he waited any longer, his father would drink the toxin and die within minutes, just as Queen Isabella had. Alexander moved swiftly through the crowd, using his royal status to push past the other guests without causing a scene. He reached the bar just as Morrison was extending the poisoned drink toward King Frederick, who was already reaching out to accept it. In that critical moment, Alexander had to make a split-second decision that would determine his father's fate. The prince knocked the glass from Morrison's hand, sending it crashing to the floor and splashing the deadly cocktail across the marble tiles. The sudden action shocked everyone present, including King Frederick, who stared at his son in confusion and embarrassment. The other guests began murmuring among themselves, wondering why the prince had caused such a disturbance at such an important event. Camilla's reaction was immediate and revealing. Instead of showing surprise or concern about the spilled drink, her face went white with rage and fear. For just a moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped completely, and everyone near the bar could see the fury in her eyes. She knew that her plan had been discovered and that her carefully orchestrated murder attempt had failed. Morrison, realizing that the conspiracy had been exposed, tried to flee through the kitchen entrance. But Detective Collins and her team were ready for exactly this scenario. The undercover officers moved quickly to surround and arrest Morrison before he could escape or destroy any evidence. The bartender's capture created additional chaos among the guests, who were now beginning to understand that something serious was happening. King Frederick, still confused but beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation, looked from his son to Camilla with growing understanding. Alexander took his father's arm and quickly explained that the drink had been poisoned and that Camilla had been planning to kill him just as she had killed Queen Isabella. The revelation hit King Frederick like a physical blow, as he realized how close he had come to death and how completely he had been deceived by someone he had trusted. As security moved to arrest Camilla, she made one final desperate attempt to escape justice, but surrounded by evidence, witnesses, and Detective Collins' carefully planned operation, there was nowhere for her to run. The woman who had smiled so inappropriately at Queen Isabella's funeral would finally face the consequences of her deadly ambitions. The arrest of Camilla sent shockwaves through the kingdom of Aldoria and beyond. As news of the conspiracy spread, the public struggled to comprehend how someone they had admired as a devoted stepmother and charitable duchess could be capable of such calculated evil. The anniversary celebration was immediately canceled, and the palace was sealed off as Detective Collins and her team conducted a comprehensive investigation of the crime scene. Camilla's capture led to a cascade of confessions from her network of conspirators. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of lengthy prison sentences, James Morrison, the bartender, immediately agreed to cooperate with authorities. His testimony revealed the full scope of Camilla's plan and provided crucial details about how Queen Isabella's murder had been carried out. Dr. Morrison, despite her initial attempts to deny involvement, eventually confessed to her role in covering up Queen Isabella's poisoning. The respected physician had falsified medical records and deliberately avoided conducting tests that would have revealed the true cause of death. Her confession was particularly devastating because it showed how Camilla had corrupted someone whose oath was to preserve life and seek truth. Thomas Ashworth, the head butler, broke down during interrogation and revealed years of complicity in Camilla's schemes. He had been providing her with detailed information about the royal family's schedules, habits, and security arrangements. His betrayal was especially painful for King Frederick, who had trusted Ashworth with the most intimate details of the family's daily life. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, the chief housekeeper, provided investigators with evidence of how Camilla had systematically bought loyalty throughout the palace staff. Her record showed a pattern of financial payments that coincided with key moments in Camilla's rise to power, revealing how she had built her conspiracy over several years rather than months. As the investigation deepened, Detective Collins uncovered evidence that Camilla's ambitions extended far beyond simply eliminating Queen Isabella and King Frederick. Hidden documents found in her private chambers revealed plans for a complete reorganization of the royal succession. She had been working to position herself as regent, with the power to influence Alexander's eventual rule, effectively controlling the kingdom for decades to come. The most chilling discovery was a detailed dossier Camilla had compiled on Alexander himself. She had been studying his habits, relationships, and potential vulnerabilities, clearly planning to either control or eliminate him if he posed a threat to her power. The prince realized that his investigation had likely saved not only his father's life, but his own as well. King Frederick struggled to come to terms with the betrayal. In private conversations with Alexander, The king revealed his deep guilt over having been so completely deceived by Camilla. He had genuinely believed that she loved him and cared for the royal family, making her betrayal even more painful than the threat to his life. The emotional impact of discovering that his wife had murdered his mother was almost too much for the grieving king to bear. The legal proceedings against Camilla and her conspirators became the most closely watched trial in Aldorian history. The evidence presented by Detective Collins and her team was overwhelming, including the toxicology reports, financial records, recorded conversations, and testimony from multiple conspirators. Camilla's defense team could only argue for leniency based on mental illness, but the calculated nature of her crimes made such arguments ineffective. During the trial, additional evidence emerged about Camilla's past victims. Investigators from other jurisdictions came forward with information about Robert Sterling and the other wealthy men who had died under suspicious circumstances. The pattern was clear. Camilla had been perfecting her murder methods for years, always targeting wealthy or powerful men who could advance her social and financial position. The trial also revealed the sophisticated nature of Camilla's poison. Forensic experts testified that the toxin she had used was virtually undetectable using standard medical tests, explaining how she had been able to kill multiple victims without being caught. Her background in pharmaceutical research had given her knowledge that most criminals could never access, making her an unusually dangerous killer. Alexander testified about his investigation and his grandmother's final letter, bringing many observers to tears as he described Queen Isabella's fears and her attempt to warn him about Camilla's true nature. His testimony was particularly powerful because it showed how the elderly queen had suspected the truth but had been unable to prove her fears before. It was too late. The prosecution painted a picture of Camilla as a cold-blooded killer who had used her beauty and charm to gain access to victims, then systematically murdered them for personal gain. They argued that her crimes were especially heinous because she had violated the trust placed in her by people who had welcomed her into their families and their hearts. King Frederick's testimony was perhaps the most emotionally devastating moment of the trial. The monarch described how Camilla had comforted him during his mother's illness, all while knowing that she was the cause of Queen Isabella's suffering. Her ability to maintain such a convincing facade while committing murder revealed a level of callousness that shocked even experienced legal professionals. As the trial neared its conclusion, public opinion had turned completely against Camilla. The woman who had once been celebrated for her charitable work and devotion to the royal family was now reviled as one of the most calculating killers in the kingdom's history. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse demanding justice for Queen Isabella and the other victims of Camilla's ambitions. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who had followed the evidence. Camilla was found guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, conspiracy, and treason against the crown. The judge, in announcing the sentence, noted that her crimes had not only taken innocent lives but had threatened the very stability of the kingdom's government. Camilla was led away to begin serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. She maintained the same emotionless expression that had characterized her throughout the trial. There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of her victims, and no recognition of the pain she had caused. Even in defeat, she remained as cold and calculating as she had been when planning her murders. 1 year after Camilla's conviction, the Kingdom of Aldoria had begun the long process of healing from the trauma of betrayal and murder that had shaken the royal family to its core. King Frederick, though forever changed by the events, had gradually resumed his royal duties, with a new appreciation for the loyalty of those who had remained true during the darkest period of his reign, the anniversary of Queen Isabella's death was marked not with the elaborate state funeral that had unknowingly celebrated her killer's triumph, but with a quiet memorial service attended only by family and the closest friends who had truly loved the late queen. Alexander stood beside his father as they placed fresh flowers on his grandmother's tomb, finally able to mourn her properly, knowing that justice had been served. Detective Collins had been honored with the kingdom's highest civilian award for her role in exposing the conspiracy and preventing King Frederick's murder. Her meticulous investigation had not only solved Queen Isabella's killing, but it also led to the resolution of several other cold cases involving Camilla's previous victims. The detective had proven that even the most carefully planned crimes could be unraveled through persistence and attention to detail. The palace staff had undergone a complete reorganization following the trial. All of Camilla's conspirators had been dismissed and faced their own criminal charges, while new security protocols were implemented to prevent future infiltration by those with malicious intent. The hiring process now included extensive background checks and psychological evaluations designed to identify potential threats before they could gain access to the royal family. Alexander had emerged from the ordeal as a more mature and capable leader, his investigation having demonstrated the sharp intellect and unwavering commitment to justice that would serve him well as future king. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about trust, betrayal, and the importance of questioning what others might accept at face value. His willingness to pursue the truth despite personal risk had earned him the respect of both the public and his father. King Frederick had made the difficult decision to seek counseling to help him process the emotional trauma of Camilla's betrayal. The realization that he had been living with his mother's killer, sharing his bed with a woman who had murdered the person he loved most, had left deep psychological scars that required professional help to heal. His openness about seeking mental health support had helped reduce stigma around such issues throughout the kingdom. The investigation had also led to important changes in the kingdom's medical and legal systems. New protocols were established requiring more extensive toxicology testing in cases of unexpected death, especially when valuable inheritances or political power were at stake. The case had shown how easily sophisticated poisoning could be, disguised as natural causes when the proper tests weren't conducted. Dr. Morrison faced not only criminal charges but also the loss of her medical license and professional reputation. Her fall from respected physician to convicted conspirator served as a stark reminder of how financial pressure and personal weakness could corrupt even those in positions of great trust and responsibility. The medical community used her case as an example of why ethical standards could never be compromised, regardless of external pressures. The broader investigation into Camilla's past had brought closure to several families who had lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances. Robert Sterling's children finally learned the truth about their father's death, while other families gained answers about deaths that had puzzled them for years. While the knowledge was painful, it allowed these families to properly grieve and find some measure of peace. The international implications of the case had also been significant. Camilla's crimes had involved victims from multiple countries, leading to enhanced cooperation between law enforcement agencies and new protocols for investigating suspicious deaths among the wealthy and powerful. The case had shown that sophisticated criminals could operate across borders and that international cooperation was essential to bring them to justice. Alexander often reflected on his grandmother's final letter and her warning to trust no one completely. While the experience had made him more cautious in his relationships, it had also taught him to value those who had proven their loyalty under the most difficult circumstances. Detective Collins, in particular, had become a trusted friend whose integrity and dedication had saved his family from complete destruction. The prince had also gained a deeper appreciation for the weight of royal responsibility. His grandmother's murder had shown him how the monarchy's position made it a target for those who would use violence to gain power. He understood that future threats would always exist and that vigilance would be the price of maintaining both his family's safety and the kingdom's stability. King Frederick had chosen to honor his mother's memory by establishing the Queen Isabella Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic violence and families affected by betrayal crimes. The foundation provided counseling services, legal assistance, and financial support to those who had suffered similar traumas. It was a fitting tribute to a woman who had always placed the welfare of others above her own interests. As Alexander looked toward his future role as king, he carried with him the lessons learned from this terrible chapter in his family's history. He understood that leadership required not just ceremonial duties and political skill, but also the courage to confront difficult truths and the wisdom to distinguish between genuine loyalty and calculated deception. The kingdom of Aldoria had survived its greatest crisis in generations, emerging stronger and more united than before. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy the royal family had instead revealed the strength of the bonds between the monarchy and those who truly served the crown with honor and integrity. Queen Isabella's legacy lived on not just in the justice that had been achieved for her murder, but in the stronger, more secure kingdom that had emerged from the darkness of betrayal. Her death had been avenged, her killer punished, and her family protected from future threats. In the end, truth and justice had prevailed over deception and evil, ensuring that her sacrifice would not be forgotten and her murderer's smile would never again hide in plain sight.